This sequence takes a somatic movement flow usually targeted on the QL muscle and changes the focus to the pelvic floor. It's beneficial for both hyper and hypotonic pelvic floor issues, so whether your pelvic floor is either too tight or too lax, as the pandiculation will help to reset the muscles to neutral. So let's begin lying on our backs with knees bent and feet flat to the floor. And let's take the feet just a little wider than hip width apart. We'll have the arms down by the sides. Give yourself a moment to settle. And become aware of your breathing. And particularly the movement of the diaphragm, so the dome of muscle that's separating your upper and lower torso at the base of your rib cage. So you're watching this diaphragm pushing downwards a little on an inhalation and drawing upwards a little on an exhalation. And then you can drop attention even further down towards the pelvic floor, which is another dome of muscle, the dome of muscle at the base of the pelvis, which mirrors the shape of the diaphragm, and thus the movement of the diaphragm when you breathe. So it's subtle when breath is at its natural pace, but you might notice that as you inhale and the diaphragm pushes downwards a little bit, the pelvic floor pushes downwards a little bit. And that as you exhale and the diaphragm lifts, so too does the pelvic floor. So let's exaggerate this now by taking 3 deep abdominal breaths. So you're going to inhale to the belly, feeling the belly expanding as you fill your lungs with air, noticing a gentle pressure to your pelvic floor. So you're inhaling. Diaphragm pushes downwards, back maybe arches a little, pelvic floor expands. Then you're exhaling. Diaphragm softens, back lengthens, and pelvic floor relaxes. So take a couple more deep breaths like that. Just notice how connected or not you are to your pelvic floor. So you might be finding it quite difficult to feel the relationship between pelvic floor and diaphragm and breath and so on. So you're just noticing your level of connection. And we're also setting an intention just to get to know pelvic floor a little bit better, to understand how it supports us in movements that maybe are targeted on other things like the hips or the back or these muscles or these areas get spoken about quite a lot, but pelvic floor doesn't really get mentioned. So we're just setting an intention to wake up pelvic floor, get to know it a little bit better by doing movements that are already familiar to us. And then very gently, let's do a micro arch and flatten of the back. So tip your pelvis forward a little so that your back arches, a little arc of space beneath you, and your shoulders press down into the floor. And then you're going to gently tip your pelvis backwards so that your back lengthens. And you're feeling your shoulders lighten on the floor. So it's a micro movement really, very small. Tip the pelvis forward, so that's your tail pressing down towards the floor and the belly lifting as you move the pelvis forward, and then you tip the pelvis backwards, and that's the top of the pelvis pressing into the floor and the belly pressing down. So do that about 3 times, nice and slowly, as easily and as smoothly as you can. And then be still and let your pelvis rest and relax. So pelvis feeling heavy, sinking down into the floor, muscles letting go of the grip of the pelvis. And then let's make a similar movement of the pelvis, but from side to side now. So you're just going to press the right side of the pelvis down into the floor so that your left side lightens, but you don't have to actively lift it. And then you press the left side down into the floor so that the right side lightens. And again, you don't have to lift it. So going from side to side. So these gentle opening movements are just warming up the hips, the low back in preparation for our somatic movement flow. You might also be noticing what's going on in your pelvic floor as you do this. So keep going. So we're going for about 3 repetitions of this either side. So you might notice a gentle massage of your pelvic floor muscles as you do this. And once that's done, again, let it go and relax completely. And you're not just noticing your back muscles relax or your hips relaxing or your shoulders relaxing even, but you're noticing your pelvic floor muscles relaxing. And then let's join these 4 movements together in a smooth circular flow. So we can tip the pelvis forward, tail presses to the floor, and then perhaps press the right side of the pelvis down, and then the top of the pelvis, and then the left side of the pelvis. So you're keeping the hips on the floor. It's like a micro circle. Keep going. Again, about 3 repetitions of this nice, smooth, circular movement round. And with this one, you'll probably notice that on the downward arc of the circle, so when your tail is pressing to the floor and your back is arching, your pelvic floor will be open, relaxed, and on the upward arc, let's change direction. On the upward arc, when the back of the pelvis is pressing to the floor and the back is lengthening, but the pelvic floor will be activated, it will be squeezing slightly. So you can always exaggerate that squeeze and release of your pelvic floor when you're making any of these circular movements of the hips in your practice. Retuning into your pelvic floor, bringing awareness to it. So again, about 3 repetitions in this reverse direction, and then we're letting it go. Let's take another 3 deep breaths to see if you can find that connection between the movement of the diaphragm and the movement of the pelvic floor. So inhaling, you're feeling the diaphragm press downwards. That is what expands your belly when you inhale, the diaphragm pressing down into your abdominal organs. And also a pressure to your pelvic floor. And then you exhale and the diaphragm returns to neutral. The abdominal organs return to their natural resting place and the pelvic floor naturally draws up a little bit. So a couple more deep breaths. You might notice a natural arcing and lengthening of your back that occurs with your breathing. So inhalation associated with the arc, exhalation with the lengthen. And then when your breath returns to its natural rhythm, let's activate your feet, spreading and lengthening your toes. And believe it or not, the arches of your feet also inform the arch of your pelvic floor. So it's good to have your feet active when you're wanting to awaken and do work with pelvic floor muscles. So you're spreading and lengthening your toes. And we're going to push down into right foot now to lift the right hip up away from the floor. So here the hip is lifting, so you're tipping your pelvis to the left and your knees stay upright. And then slowly, slowly, let's lower that right hip down and relax it. And then let's lift the left hip up away from the floor. So left kneecap is reaching forward, it's not going over to the right, you're tipping your pelvis to the right though. So left hip riding up high and then slowly lowering down and relaxing. And then we'll lift the right hip again. So notice what's happening to your pelvic floor as you lift your right hip. So already a slight drawing and up of pelvic floor. And then squeeze your thighs or your knees together with your right hip lifted. So that's going to exaggerate the action of pelvic floor. And then you open your knees, your thighs apart, you lower your right hip down and you relax, and you particularly relax the pelvic floor muscles. Do the same thing on the left side. So your feet are active, remember. So active feet helps to activate pelvic floor. So you're lifting that left hip up so the pelvis is rolling to the right. And then with your hip lifted, you squeeze your thighs or your knees together. And you feel pelvic floor drawing in and up all the more. And then you open the knees and thighs, you lower the hip down, you return to neutral, and you completely relax. So we're going to take this a step further now, just make it a little more complicated. So there's quite a dance of squeeze, release of pelvic floor going on, so you can just track that in your own awareness. So we're going to activate the right foot, lift that right hip, squeeze the thighs or the knees together, and then keeping the knees together, lift both your hips up and level them out. So knees are together, hips are together, they're level here, pelvic floor draws in and up all the more. And then you're lowering your right hip down onto the floor, keeping your left hip lifted for a moment, and then lowering your left hip down and opening your knees, your thighs out, returning to neutral and completely relaxing. So you can see that there's quite a complex crisscross interweaving of activity along that mesh of pelvic floor as we make that action. So we're going to do it again on the left side. So activate your feet, lift your left hip up high. So the right hip stays on the floor at this point. You lift your left hip up high. You squeeze your thighs or your knees together. And then keeping your knees together, you lift your right hip as well. So level everything out. Hips are level, knees are level, and you're drawing pelvic floor in and up. That might be a conscious action here. And then you're lowering your left hip down, just left hip. So right hip stays lifted. So it might feel a bit awkward if you're not familiar with it. And then you lower your right hip down, you open your knees out and you relax. And you particularly relax your pelvic floor. So we're going to do this twice more. Active feet. Lift your right hip up so pelvis rolls to the left. Squeeze your knees, your thighs together with the right hip lifted. Then also lift your left hip up, which should level out the pelvis and the knees, and actively draw pelvic floor in and up. And then you're tipping your right hip to come down onto the floor with your left hip lifted. And then you're lowering your left hip down, opening the knees out and relaxing. Relaxing your hips, your butt, your back, your feet, and your pelvic floor. Left side, lift the left hip up. Squeeze the thighs with the hip lifted. Also lift your right hip up and level things out. So your thighs are together, your hips are level, your knees are level. And then you're lowering your left hip down, so that might bring your left knee a little closer towards you and move your right knee further away from you. And then your right hip comes down, you open the knees out and you relax. Completely relax in between these rounds of movement, because it's in the relaxation that the muscle is doing its resetting. So this notion of pandiculation, where you consciously contract, slowly release, and then completely relax the muscle, is what resets it to neutral functioning. So the relaxation part is an important piece. So let's do one more round. So push down into active right foot. So lifting right hip up, And then you're squeezing thighs, knees together. So it feels like the legs are in almost like a little scissor position there. And then you're also lifting your left hip up, which then levels the legs out. And you're pressing the little toe sides of the feet down into the floor in this position. And then the right hip goes down. So that's going to draw your right knee a little closer towards you and move your left knee a little further away from you. So you're back in that scissor action of the legs. And then you're lowering your left hip down and opening the knees out and relaxing. And then final one on the left, active feet, lift your left hip, squeeze your thighs, your knees. Also lift your right hip. So at this point you're level and the inner and outer edges of the feet are pressing firmly to the floor. Pelvic floor is drawing in and up. And then you're lowering your left hip down. So left knee comes a little towards you, right knee moves a little away from you. And then the right hip comes down. And you open your knees out and you relax completely. You're back in neutral, you're relaxing. And then let's gently rock the pelvis back and forth like we did at the beginning. So a micro arch and flatten. So you tip pelvis forward to lift the low back a little from the floor, and then you tip the pelvis backwards to flatten the back into the floor. So again, about 3 repetitions of this. You might notice that the movement is much smoother, much easier, much more refined. Perhaps you can make a smaller movement than you were able to do at the beginning because the muscle movement is more refined now. And then you let that go. And take the side to side. So here it's not a big lift of the hip like we've just been doing. You just press the back of the right hip down into the floor and naturally the left hip lifts a little, and then you press the back of the left hip down. So the focus here is on pressing one hip down rather than lifting one hip up. So side to side, and again you might find that your body just feels a little better oiled, more lubricated, more easeful than it did before. So about 3 repetitions. And then you're relaxing and letting it all go. And then the circles. So you might tip pelvis forward, go off to right side, press right side of the pelvis down, then top of the pelvis down, then left side down, and then the tail down. So again, this is a kind of a micro movement. You're not making a big arcing movement to lift the back away from the floor. You're just simply tracing a very mindful circle of pressure around your low back. So you want about 3 in each direction. So changing direction when you're ready. So going off in the opposite direction and noticing what's happening in your pelvic floor. So the opening of pelvic floor that happens on that downward arc when your back is arching, and then the draw in and up of pelvic floor on the backward arc when the back is lengthening. And you can exaggerate that. You can invite a little squeeze in and up of your pelvic floor as the pelvis tips backwards. And again, you just might feel that you're better connected to pelvic floor now than you were. And when those 3 or so repetitions have been completed, just let it all go. And take another 3 deep breaths. So this really is our post check, just to see whether you're more aware of pelvic floor, whether you've got more movement in pelvic floor with the breath, and whether you feel like you have a little more freedom there. So you're taking a deep breath down into the belly, into the pelvis. So you're feeling the belly swelling as your diaphragm pulls down into the abdominal cavity, and you're feeling a little bit of pressure on the pelvic floor and perhaps an arch of your back, again a micro arch. And then as you exhale, it's all going in reverse. The diaphragm's pulling up, the abdominal organs are settling down, and the pelvic floor muscles are drawing in and up. So a couple more deep breaths here. And when those 3 breaths are complete, just taking a few moments to rest.